The afternoon was unusually quiet. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. Cars passed by in a slow, steady rhythm, their tires humming against the pavement. A small suburban neighborhood, far removed from the bustle of the city, stood in its peaceful stillness. But today, something was about to disrupt that peace, something no one would expect. A woman was driving her car, cruising down the road on her way home from work. She wasn't in a rush, just enjoying the calmness of the afternoon. Her car, a simple sedan, hummed along as she steered it through the neighborhood streets. The radio played softly in the background, her thoughts drifting between the events of the day and what she would have for dinner later. As she turned a corner, her car passed a police cruiser parked on the side of the road. She barely noticed it, focused on the road ahead. But suddenly the sirens blared to life behind her. She glanced at the rearview mirror and saw the flashing lights. Her stomach dropped, and instinctively she pulled over to the side of the road. The woman wasn't in any trouble. At least she didn't think she was. She wasn't speeding, and her car was in good condition. Yet the sound of the sirens still brought a tightness to her chest. She slowed to a stop and turned off the engine, waiting as the police officer stepped out of his car and approached hers. The officer was young, his face still carrying the remnants of a teenager's softness. He was in his early 30s with short-cropped hair and a posture that showed confidence. Perhaps too much confidence for someone so new to the force. He walked up to her window and looked down at her with a stern, almost accusatory gaze. His hand rested just above the holster of his gun, but there was no immediate need for it. His presence alone seemed to radiate authority. "License and registration," he said, his voice sharp and commanding, though his tone lacked the professionalism she was used to from law enforcement. The woman nodded, not wanting to escalate anything. She quickly reached into the glove compartment and handed him her documents, offering a polite smile. "Here you go, officer." The officer took the documents without saying another word. He glanced at them briefly, scanning her name and other details. Then, without explanation, he asked, "What's your reason for driving so fast today?" The question caught her off guard. She was sure she hadn't been speeding. She had been driving the same way she always did. "I wasn't speeding, officer," she said, her voice calm and steady. "I don't know what you mean." The officer didn't look convinced. His eyes narrowed and he leaned in closer to the window. "You were going too fast. I'll need you to step out of the car." The woman was now confused. She hadn't done anything wrong. Yet the officer seemed to be escalating the situation for no apparent reason. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. She had heard stories of officers overstepping their boundaries, and she wasn't about to make this worse by arguing. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady but with a hint of concern. The officer didn't answer. Instead, he motioned for her to open the door. "Get out of the car, now." His tone was sharper now, and there was an edge of authority that made her feel uncomfortable. But she complied, opening the door and stepping out of the car. She was taller than he was, but in that moment it felt like she was being made to shrink under his gaze. As she stood beside her car, the officer circled around her, eyeing her with suspicion. He didn't say a word as he walked behind her and then back to the front. The woman stood still, unsure of how to react, her heart beating faster. She tried to keep calm, but something about the officer's behavior made her uneasy. "Do you have any idea how fast you were going?" the officer finally asked, his voice now less about questioning and more about accusing. He was growing frustrated, and she could sense that this wasn't going to be a simple traffic stop. "I wasn't speeding, officer. I was going the speed limit," she replied, her voice firm but polite. "I don't understand why you're so upset." The officer ignored her response and moved even closer, now standing directly in front of her. He was getting too close for comfort. The woman could feel the tension building between them, the air thick with unspoken aggression. His presence felt overpowering, and she instinctively took a small step back. Then, before she could process what was happening, the officer raised his hand and struck her across the face. The slap was sharp, and it caught her completely off guard. Her body jerked from the sudden pain, and for a moment everything felt like it had stopped. The world around her seemed to freeze in time. She stood there, her cheek stinging from the impact, staring at the officer in disbelief. The officer seemed almost surprised at his own action, as though he hadn't fully realized what he had just done. He paused for a second, his hand still raised but no longer hovering in the air. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, but it quickly vanished. He looked at her, waiting for a reaction. The woman stood frozen, her hand instinctively touching her face where she could still feel the heat of the slap. She could feel the blood rising to her cheeks, not from the physical pain but from the sheer humiliation of what had just occurred. In the past, she had been in tough situations. She had been trained to handle intense pressure, but this was different. This wasn't a criminal. This was a police officer, someone who was supposed to serve and protect the public. Yet, in a blink of an eye, he had crossed a line that no one, especially not someone in his position, should have crossed. But despite the shock and pain, she remained calm. She knew what she had to do. She wasn't just anyone. She wasn't a defenseless bystander. She was an FBI agent. Without a word, she reached inside her jacket, pulling out her badge. The metal gleamed in the afternoon light, and as she held it up, the officer's face drained of color. He took a step back, his expression shifting from confusion to panic. "I'm an FBI agent," she said, her voice steady but firm. "And what you just did was assault." The officer's mind raced as he stood there, unable to process the situation. He had hit an FBI agent, a federal agent. His face flushed with embarrassment and fear. For the first time since this encounter had started, the officer didn't know what to say. His bravado had melted away, leaving behind only the heavy weight of his mistake. The woman remained calm, her hand still holding the badge in front of him. She didn't yell or make threats. She simply stared at him, waiting for him to fully grasp the gravity of what he had done. The officer stood there for a long moment, unsure of how to react. His breath quickened and he looked around as though searching for help. But there was no escape from the reality of the situation. The officer had made a mistake and now he would have to face the consequences. The woman didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice, but her eyes, cold, unwavering, spoke volumes. She had been wronged and she wasn't going to let this slide. In the stillness of that moment, both of them stood there, caught in a standoff. One was a law enforcement officer, supposed to uphold the law. The other was a federal agent, someone who had seen her fair share of difficult situations. But this one was different. This one wasn't just about a traffic stop gone wrong. This was about power, respect, and accountability. And for the officer, it was a moment he would never forget. The officer stood there, stunned by the realization of what he had just done. He had struck a woman, and worse, he had struck an FBI agent. A feeling of dread washed over him as the weight of the situation sank in. His hand, still hovering in the air from the slap, slowly fell to his side. He wasn't sure what to do next. The confidence he had moments before when he first approached the car had evaporated entirely. The woman, her hand still pressed against her cheek, didn't react in anger. She didn't scream or lash out. Instead, she remained still, the calmness in her demeanor almost unnerving. Her eyes never left him, cold and unwavering as she waited for him to process what had just happened. Her silence was more powerful than any words she could have spoken. The officer cleared his throat, attempting to regain some composure. "I didn't know," he muttered, his voice trembling. "I didn't know who you were." His words were weak, an attempt at justification that only made the situation worse. "I thought you were, well, I didn't know what to think. I just reacted." The woman didn't say anything immediately. She knew that words at this moment wouldn't matter. He had acted on impulse, and now there was no going back. His reaction had been rash, driven by something other than the facts. It didn't matter if he hadn't known she was an FBI agent. The fact was he had crossed a line. Still, she remained calm. "You shouldn't have reacted like that," she said quietly, her voice steady. "No one should. Not under any circumstances." The officer looked down at the ground, unable to meet her gaze. The moment of bravado he had once held had vanished, leaving behind only shame and regret. He had been trained to handle confrontations, but this was different. The woman was right. He had allowed his emotions to take control of the situation, and now he was the one who had to face the consequences. In the silence that followed, the woman reached into her jacket once again, this time pulling out her phone. She didn't need to say a word. The officer knew exactly what was coming. She wasn't going to let him walk away from this, not after what had just happened. She began dialing her superior at the FBI. The officer stood there, feeling more and more like a child caught in a lie. He knew there was no excuse for what he had done. He had allowed himself to let anger and frustration get the best of him. There were no shortcuts, no way out of the situation. The consequences would come whether he was ready for them or not. The woman spoke briefly into her phone, her words low and controlled, but he could hear the firmness in her tone. She was speaking to someone important, someone who would make sure this was handled properly. He could tell that she wasn't angry, not like he might have expected. She was just calm, and that calmness only made the gravity of the situation more real for him. When she finished the call, she looked at him, her expression unchanged. "Backup is on the way," she said, her voice steady. "You should prepare yourself for what comes next." The officer didn't respond. He was still trying to process everything. How had he gotten here? How had he gone from a routine traffic stop to assaulting a federal agent? It was as if the events had spiraled out of his control, and now he was just watching as the pieces fell apart. Soon, the sound of another police car could be heard approaching. The woman glanced over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the road. Her posture remained as composed as ever, but the officer could sense the tension in her. She wasn't scared. She wasn't panicking, but the situation had just become very serious. The backup unit pulled up beside them, and 2 more officers stepped out. They looked at the woman first, then at the officer who had struck her. It didn't take long for them to put the pieces together. One of the backup officers, a man in his late 40s, looked at the young officer and shook his head. The disappointment in his eyes was clear. "What the hell happened here?" the older officer asked, his voice laced with frustration. The woman didn't speak immediately. She let the young officer respond, though it was clear he didn't know where to begin. He stammered, trying to explain himself, but his words came out disjointed. I didn't mean to. I just got angry. She wasn't cooperating and—" "You hit her?" the older officer interrupted, his voice rising in disbelief. He looked at the woman, who remained silent but composed. "Is that true?" The woman nodded, her gaze never leaving the young officer. "Yes, it is," she said simply. The older officer exhaled sharply, his frustration evident. He turned away for a moment, then spoke to his partner, who was standing off to the side watching the scene unfold. "Get your supervisor on the phone. We need to handle this properly." The 2 backup officers moved to their squad car, leaving the woman and the young officer alone. The young officer stood there, feeling a deep sense of regret. The worst part was he knew he had made a serious mistake. He had let his emotions cloud his judgment, and now he would have to face the consequences. It was clear that the situation was spiraling out of his control, and he could only watch as things unraveled. The woman stood with him, but she didn't look at him with anger or contempt. She wasn't there to make him feel worse than he already did. She was there to make sure that what happened didn't go unaddressed. Her job wasn't just to uphold the law, but to make sure others did too. She was trained for moments like these, where calmness and control were key to making sure justice was served. The silence stretched between them. The young officer wanted to say something, anything, to explain himself, but there was nothing he could say. He knew the truth. He had acted inappropriately, and no words could change that. Minutes later, the supervisor arrived at the scene, a more senior officer who was quickly briefed on the situation. His face hardened as he assessed the scene. The young officer, his head still hanging low, stood quietly as his supervisor began to ask the woman a few questions. The older officer's voice was firm as he turned to his colleague. "We need to take him in for questioning. This is serious." The young officer looked at the ground, his heart sinking. He had no idea what was going to happen next, but he knew it wasn't going to be good. As they took him into custody, the woman watched, her face still unreadable. The officers who had witnessed the situation were already talking about what had happened, and the news would spread fast. The young officer's career was hanging by a thread, and the consequences of his actions would soon become public. For the woman, it wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about making sure that something like this didn't happen again. It was about making sure that the law was followed by everyone, no matter who they were or what badge they wore. She turned and got into her car, her mind already focused on the next steps. But as she drove away from the scene, she couldn't help but think about how quickly things could escalate, how one wrong move could change everything. It was a lesson that the officer would learn the hard way, and one that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The young officer sat in the back of the police car, his hands cuffed in front of him. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into his skin, but it was the weight of his own thoughts that hurt the most. He couldn't stop replaying the moment over and over again in his mind. The slap he had given, the shock on her face when she revealed who she was. He was still in disbelief about the whole situation. How had everything escalated so quickly? The woman, the FBI agent, hadn't screamed or shouted at him. She hadn't retaliated or made a scene. Instead, she had calmly pulled out her badge and showed him who she was. That small metallic symbol of authority had completely shifted the entire dynamic. Her calmness, her control, had only made him feel worse. It was as if she had known all along that he would be the one to lose control. The car bumped gently as it moved, and the young officer could feel every second passing by in silence. He didn't know where they were taking him, but it didn't matter. His career was over. His actions had already set everything in motion. He had hit a woman, but not just any woman. She was a federal agent, someone who was trained to handle high-pressure situations, and he had acted out of anger and frustration. How had he let things get so out of hand? The officer's mind was racing. He thought about everything that had led up to the moment of the slap. When he had first approached her car, she had been calm. She hadn't given him any reason to be upset. She had done everything he asked, even when he started questioning her. But there was something about her calm demeanor that set him off. Maybe it was her confidence. Maybe it was the way she didn't seem intimidated by him, by his uniform, by his badge. But whatever it was, he couldn't control himself. He had made the mistake of letting his own insecurities take over, and now he was paying for it. The officer had always prided himself on being calm under pressure, but in that moment, he had failed. He had acted impulsively, allowing his frustration to get the best of him. He couldn't take back what he had done. The reality of his actions hit him hard. He had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. The car turned a corner, and the officer snapped out of his thoughts. He looked out the window but didn't really see anything. His mind was elsewhere, consumed with the consequences of his actions. What would happen to him now? He had assaulted a federal agent. That wasn't something that could just be brushed under the rug. He knew there would be an investigation, that everything would be scrutinized from the moment he first pulled her over to the moment he struck her. He had already been told that there were cameras on the street. There would be footage of everything. He couldn't avoid the fact that he was the one in the wrong. But the guilt was starting to eat away at him. His heart pounded in his chest and he could feel his throat tightening. He had wanted to be a good cop, to protect and serve, but now he had done the opposite. He had become the thing he swore to stand against. Meanwhile, the woman, the FBI agent, was already taking the necessary steps to ensure that the situation was handled appropriately. She had done her part, remaining calm and composed when faced with aggression, but she knew there was more to do. She wasn't angry with the officer. She wasn't out for revenge. What she wanted was accountability. She wanted to make sure that what had happened wasn't ignored, that justice would be served. She had made the call to her superiors, and soon, her supervisor arrived on the scene. He was an older man, someone she respected deeply for his professionalism and dedication to the job. He had already begun to make calls of his own, getting in touch with internal affairs and other necessary parties to ensure that the incident was investigated thoroughly. She could tell from his stern demeanor that he wasn't going to let this slide. The officer who had assaulted her would be held accountable. There was no question about that. She knew the system and she trusted it, but she also knew that it was her responsibility to make sure the right steps were taken. This wasn't just about her. It was about making sure that officers like the young man who had struck her understood that their actions had consequences. While she waited for the investigation to unfold, she couldn't help but think about the officer's career. She had seen officers in the field lose control before. It was a tough job and sometimes emotions ran high, but what he had done was different. This wasn't a moment of frustration in the heat of a chase or a dangerous situation. This was a simple traffic stop that had spiraled out of control. She had to wonder, though, how many other officers might be struggling with their own frustrations in ways that the public never saw. What had led this officer to make the decision to strike her? She wasn't sure, but she hoped that this incident would spark a larger conversation about how police officers handle their emotions and stress. She had been in difficult situations before, had faced danger and hostility, but she had always maintained control, and that was the difference between her and the young officer. She had learned to keep calm under pressure. He hadn't. As she sat in her car waiting for everything to unfold, she thought about the bigger picture. This wasn't just about one officer. This was about a system that needed to hold its members accountable, no matter their rank or position. She had worked hard to get where she was, and she wasn't about to let someone's poor judgment go unnoticed. Back in the holding area, the young officer sat on a bench, his head hung low. He had been read his rights and was waiting for the inevitable, an interrogation and then the paperwork that would seal his fate. His stomach churned with nerves and his hands shook slightly despite being cuffed. He had never been in a situation like this before. He had seen fellow officers in trouble for misconduct, but he had never imagined he would be the one in that position. What had started as a normal day had turned into a nightmare. He had been just another officer on the street performing his duties until everything went wrong. He couldn't shake the image of the woman's face after he had struck her. She hadn't cried out in pain, hadn't shouted at him. She had simply revealed who she was, and in that moment everything changed. The reality of the situation hit him harder than any slap could have. He thought about the way she had calmly handled everything, how she had remained composed even in the face of aggression. He couldn't imagine what it must have been like for her to be struck by someone who was supposed to protect and serve. How did she manage to stay so calm? He wasn't sure, but he knew it had made him look even worse. He knew there was no way to justify what he had done. No matter what he said now, no matter how sorry he was, the damage had been done. His colleagues would see him as a failure, as someone who couldn't control his emotions. The public would hear about it too. The cameras on the street had recorded everything, and soon everyone would know what he had done. He would be the subject of news stories, a cautionary tale about what happens when law enforcement fails to keep control. As the hours passed, the officer's mind raced. He thought about his future, about his family, about everything he had worked for. It was all slipping through his fingers now. But more than that, he thought about the woman. What had she felt in that moment? Had he hurt her more than just physically? He would never know the answer to that, but he would have to live with the consequences of his actions for the rest of his life. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, snapping him out of his thoughts. He looked up to see his supervisor approaching, a serious expression on his face. The officer knew the moment of reckoning had come. The next few hours felt like days to the young officer. He had been transferred to a small, sterile room inside the police station, sitting alone in a metal chair. The lights above flickered every so often, casting a harsh glare against the cold gray walls. He hadn't been given much to do other than wait. No one spoke to him except for a few passing officers who would glance at him with disappointment. It was like being in a limbo, neither here nor there, just waiting for the inevitable. Every time the door opened, his heart would race, thinking it was someone coming to speak to him about what had happened. But each time it was just another officer passing by. The room seemed to grow smaller with each passing minute, and the pressure in his chest felt like it was about to crush him. Outside the room, the buzz of voices, footsteps, and the occasional ringing of a phone were constant reminders that the world was still moving. People had things to do, lives to live, while he was stuck here, being judged, waiting for everything he had worked for to fall apart. He kept replaying the moment over and over in his head. He couldn't escape the image of her face when he had hit her, the shock in her eyes, the calmness with which she had revealed who she was, an FBI agent. His stomach churned at the thought. He had always thought of himself as a decent guy, someone who followed the rules and respected the law. But in that moment he had failed. He had crossed a line he never should have, and now there was no going back. The thought of losing everything, the job he had worked so hard to get, his reputation, his future, was almost too much to bear. He had joined the police force to help people, to make a difference, but now it felt like all of that had been for nothing. His actions would overshadow everything else he had ever done. All he could think about was the face of the woman he had assaulted, and how he would never be able to erase the memory of what he had done. The door to the small room finally opened, and this time, it wasn't just a passing officer. His supervisor entered, followed by a few others, including a senior officer who had been involved in the investigation. The young officer looked up at them, his face pale and his posture slumped. He knew this was it. This was the moment when everything would change. The supervisor didn't waste any time. He didn't ask the young officer how he was feeling, or offer any words of comfort. Instead, he got straight to the point. "We've reviewed the footage," the supervisor said, his voice low but firm. We've spoken with witnesses and we've confirmed everything. You struck an FBI agent and you escalated a situation that should never have gone that far. You will be placed on administrative leave while an internal investigation is conducted." The young officer nodded slowly, knowing there was nothing he could say to change what had happened. The words felt like a punch to the gut. Administrative leave? He had known it was coming, but hearing it out loud somehow made it more real. His hands clenched into fists in his lap, but he didn't speak. What was there to say? Another officer, older and more experienced, spoke up. "You've broken protocol, son. You've broken trust, not just with the FBI agent, but with your fellow officers and the public. You've put your entire career in jeopardy." The young officer's throat tightened. He had never felt so small in his life. This wasn't just about the slap anymore. This was about everything he had worked for, everything he had believed in crashing down around him. The trust that he had built over the years, the relationships with his colleagues, his sense of purpose. All of it was now shattered because of one moment of poor judgment. The senior officer didn't let up. "You don't just get to walk away from this, you know. What you did is not something that can be forgotten or overlooked. There will be an investigation and you'll be held accountable." The young officer swallowed hard, his face flushed with shame. He knew the severity of his actions, but hearing it laid out so bluntly made it even more real. He had always imagined his future with the police force, doing good, helping people, making a difference. But now that future seemed distant and unreachable. His supervisor continued. "The FBI agent you assaulted, she's not pressing charges at the moment, but make no mistake, this is a serious matter. You will be questioned and there will be a review of your record and your actions. The department will decide what happens next." The young officer could hardly focus on the words anymore. His thoughts were clouded with the images of his own failure. He had let his anger and frustration control him, and now it was too late to undo the damage. The senior officer's voice cut through his thoughts. "This isn't just about you, officer. It's about the whole department. You're a reflection of everything we stand for, and when you make a mistake like this, it impacts everyone. You're lucky she didn't press charges, but don't think for a second that it's over. It's far from it." The young officer nodded again, not trusting himself to speak. He felt like a child being scolded, but there was no one else to blame. He had done this to himself. The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of the conversation hanging heavy in the air. Finally, his supervisor spoke again, his tone softer this time. "You've got a lot to think about. I hope you'll take this time to reflect on what you've done, because whatever happens next, it's up to you to make it right." With that, the officers left the room, leaving the young officer alone once again. He sat in the silence, the harsh reality of the situation sinking in. His world had been turned upside down in a matter of minutes. His career, his future, everything he had worked for, was now hanging by a thread. Outside, the woman, the FBI agent, was already moving forward with her own steps. She had been through the process herself, faced difficult situations and seen her fair share of mistakes. But what mattered now was that she had done everything by the book. She had remained calm and professional, despite the officer's aggression. She had been the bigger person in the situation, and now it was time for the system to work. She didn't seek revenge or punishment. She simply wanted accountability, a fair investigation, and for the officer to learn from his actions. It wasn't about ruining his life. It was about ensuring that something like this didn't happen again, for him or anyone else. She had made her statement clear to her superiors, and now the process would unfold. The officer would be investigated, and the department would decide what to do. But for her, the matter wasn't personal. She had a job to do, and she had done it. As for the officer, he sat there lost in his thoughts, wondering if he would ever have the chance to make things right. Would he ever get a second chance? Could he rebuild the trust he had lost? The road ahead was uncertain, and the consequences of his actions were far from over. But for now, all he could do was wait and hope that someday, somehow he would find a way to redeem himself. Days passed in a blur for the young officer. The investigation dragged on, and with each day the weight of his actions seemed heavier. The station felt quieter somehow, as if the entire department was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable conclusion. He hadn't spoken to many of his colleagues since the incident. Some avoided him altogether, while others would glance at him offering nothing but disappointment. No one knew what to say. He had been placed on administrative leave, a fate worse than being fired in some ways. It felt like his life had been put on pause, and in that time he had done nothing but reflect. He had thought about his family, how they would feel when they heard about what he had done. He thought about his friends, about the people who had trusted him. His own confidence, once so certain, had completely evaporated. There were moments when he questioned everything about himself, about his career, and even about the choices he had made leading up to that moment. But there were also moments of clarity, moments when he realized that he could only move forward from here. He had to face the consequences, but he couldn't let his mistake define the rest of his life. The hardest part was accepting that he had to change, to learn from this, and to ensure that it never happened again. Meanwhile, the woman, the FBI agent, had already moved on. She wasn't focused on the officer. She wasn't thinking about revenge. She had done what needed to be done, and had made sure that the situation was being handled according to protocol. For her, this was another day in the job. She had seen worse. She had been in more dangerous situations. What mattered to her now was that the officer would learn from this, that he would understand the gravity of his actions. In the weeks that followed, the investigation was thorough. The footage from the cameras on the street was reviewed multiple times, and every aspect of the incident was examined. There were interviews with witnesses, other officers, and of course the officer himself. It was a long and painful process, but it was necessary. The young officer had been interviewed multiple times, and each time he answered with the same regret. He couldn't offer any excuse for what he had done. He had struck a woman, a federal agent, and there was no justification for it. He had allowed his emotions to take control, and now he had to live with the consequences. He had been given the chance to explain himself, to offer his side of the story. But in the end, it didn't change anything. What he had done was wrong. There were no excuses. He had acted out of frustration, and that was the hardest part to accept. He had broken the code of conduct, the very principles that he had sworn to uphold when he joined the force. As the investigation came to a close, the department made its decision. The officer was officially fired. It wasn't a surprising outcome, but it still hit him hard. He had always known that there were rules in place to protect people from abuse of power, but now he was the one who had been on the wrong side of those rules. He had been the one who had violated the trust that the public and his fellow officers had placed in him. The decision to fire him was made by the department, but it wasn't a decision they took lightly. They had reviewed his entire record, looking at his performance, his conduct, his previous interactions with the public. And while he had been a relatively good officer up until that point, that one moment of violence overshadowed everything. It didn't matter that he had made a mistake. It didn't matter that he had been under pressure. What mattered was that he had failed to live up to the expectations of the job. As he sat in the meeting room, waiting for the official announcement, he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. This was the moment that would change everything. He had expected this, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. When the news came, it was like the final blow. He had been given a second chance, but he had thrown it away. And now there was no going back. The woman, the FBI agent, had already moved on. She had been informed of the department's decision, and while she wasn't pleased by the outcome, she wasn't surprised. For her, it wasn't about the officer's punishment. It was about making sure that incidents like this didn't happen again. She had already filed her report, and now the ball was in the department's court. She had expected an outcome like this, but part of her still felt a pang of disappointment. It wasn't that she wanted to see the officer suffer. She didn't. But there was something about seeing someone fail when they had so much potential that stung. She had hoped that the officer would learn from this, that he would rise above his mistake and become a better person because of it. But now it seemed like that wouldn't be possible. The officer's firing was a wake-up call for the entire department. It was a reminder that no one was above the law, not even those who wore the badge. The department would have to do better, to train officers on how to manage their emotions, how to de-escalate situations rather than letting them spiral out of control. The woman had seen firsthand how a small moment of frustration could lead to something much worse. And she knew that this incident would spark a conversation about how officers were trained to handle stress, how they could avoid situations like this in the future. But for the officer, the future was uncertain. He had lost his job, his career, and his reputation. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew that he had a lot of work to do. He would have to rebuild his life from the ground up, starting with the lessons he had learned from his mistake. He had to learn how to manage his emotions, how to control his impulses, and how to live with the consequences of his actions. In the days that followed, the officer struggled with his feelings of shame and regret. He didn't know where to turn or what to do next. But he knew one thing for certain: he had to take responsibility for his actions. He couldn't blame anyone else. He couldn't make excuses. He had made a mistake, and now it was up to him to make things right. The woman, the FBI agent, continued with her work. She had moved on, but the incident had left an impression on her. It had made her think about the complexities of law enforcement, about the challenges that officers faced on a daily basis. She had seen both the good and the bad in her line of work, but she had never expected to be struck by a police officer. It was a sobering reminder that no matter how much training someone had, they were still human, and they could make mistakes. For the officer, the road ahead was long and uncertain. He had lost everything that had once defined him, but that didn't mean it was the end. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where he would have to rebuild himself and prove that he could learn from his mistakes. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but he was determined to make things right no matter how long it took. In the end, both the officer and the woman walked away from the incident with lessons learned. The officer had learned the hard way that one moment of poor judgment could ruin everything. The woman had learned that even in the face of aggression, it was possible to stay calm and ensure that justice was served. It wasn't the way either of them had wanted the situation to play out, but sometimes life had a way of making things complicated, and all they could do was move forward, carrying the weight of their experiences and hoping that they could make a difference in the future. As the days turned into weeks, the young officer found himself at a crossroads in his life. His job, once the core of his identity, was now gone. He had been dismissed from the force, and with it, the sense of purpose he had once felt. The loss was more than just professional. It felt like a complete upheaval of his life, a challenge he wasn't sure how to face. He spent the first few days after his firing in a haze, unsure of what to do next. He tried to make sense of everything, but there was no easy explanation. The choice he had made in that moment, the one that had led to the slap, had cost him everything. The shame he felt was overwhelming. He had been a police officer, someone sworn to uphold the law, and yet in a single moment of frustration he had violated that very law. It wasn't just about losing his career. It was about his own self-worth. He had been trained to handle difficult situations, to stay calm, to control his emotions. But in that moment he had failed. He hadn't just let down his colleagues or his superiors. He had let himself down. And that was the hardest part to come to terms with. He had been an officer for years, but the feeling of being an outsider, of no longer being part of that community, was more difficult than he had expected. He had always been proud to wear the badge, to serve and protect. But now, without that badge, who was he? What was left of his identity? In the weeks that followed, the young officer spent a lot of time alone. He tried to reach out to a few old friends, but their responses were distant. He knew they were disappointed in him, and he couldn't blame them. How could he explain to them what had happened? How could he justify the act of violence that had ruined his life? He had been offered counseling, but at first he resisted. He didn't feel like talking to anyone, especially not someone who would try to make sense of what he had done. He didn't want pity or sympathy. He wanted to understand why he had lost control in the first place. Why had he, someone who had worked so hard to get where he was, let his emotions take over? But eventually, after days of sleepless nights and endless thoughts racing through his mind, he decided to go. He knew he needed help, even if he wasn't sure what to expect. He couldn't keep carrying the weight of his actions alone. It was time to face the truth, to confront the person he had become. The first few sessions were uncomfortable. He wasn't used to opening up to anyone, especially a stranger. But the counselor was patient, never pushing him too hard. She let him speak at his own pace, allowing him to express the guilt, the anger, and the regret that had been eating at him. Slowly, he began to understand that the anger he had felt in that moment wasn't just about the situation with the woman. It was about years of built-up frustration, pressure, and unresolved emotions. The job had taken a toll on him, but he had never acknowledged it until now. He had always prided himself on being able to handle the stress, to keep it together. But deep down, he had been struggling. As the sessions continued, the officer began to make progress. He started to recognize his own weaknesses, and for the first time, accepted that it wasn't a failure to ask for help. He didn't have all the answers, and maybe he never would. But he was learning how to rebuild himself, one small step at a time. Meanwhile, the woman, the FBI agent, was carrying on with her work. The incident had not derailed her life in the same way it had for the officer. She had been through difficult situations before, and this one, though upsetting, wasn't the first. She had done her job, handled the situation with professionalism, and moved on. But the incident had left her with something to think about. She knew that what had happened could have been avoided if the officer had managed his emotions better. But she also knew that the pressures of the job, the constant stress, could weigh heavily on anyone. She had been following the investigation closely, aware of the officer's fate. She had hoped that he would take responsibility for his actions, but she also understood the complexity of the situation. She had seen officers struggle with the pressures of the job, and she knew that the line between keeping it together and losing control could be thin. The officer's actions had consequences, but she hoped that in the long run, he would learn from this. People made mistakes, but it was how they responded to those mistakes that mattered most. The young officer's path to redemption wasn't going to be easy. It would take time, and he knew it wouldn't happen overnight. But he was determined to prove to himself and to the world that he was more than the mistake he had made. He would find a way to make things right, even if that meant starting over completely. He enrolled in anger management courses, trying to learn how to cope with his emotions in healthier ways. He spent hours reflecting on his actions, trying to understand why he had let things spiral out of control. Slowly, he started to piece his life back together, one small step at a time. His family, though disappointed, began to support him again. They saw that he was taking responsibility for what had happened, that he wasn't running away from it. They had always believed in him, and now they were starting to believe that he could overcome this. It wasn't going to be easy, but they knew he had the strength to get through it. Months passed, and the officer began to regain some sense of purpose. He found work in a completely different field, away from law enforcement. It wasn't the career he had envisioned for himself, but it was a fresh start, a chance to rebuild his life from the ground up. The work was hard, and at times it felt like a step backward, but he didn't mind. He was learning new skills, meeting new people, and slowly, he was regaining his confidence. The weight of his past mistake didn't disappear, but he was learning to carry it in a way that didn't define him. Every now and then, he would think back to that day, the day he had lost control. It would always be a part of his story, a lesson that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. But it no longer consumed him. He had made peace with the fact that he wasn't perfect, that he had made a huge mistake. But he had also come to understand that mistakes didn't have to define the rest of his life. He could learn, grow, and move forward. The woman, too, continued with her work, making sure that justice was always served. She never sought out recognition for what had happened, never expected thanks. It wasn't about her. It was about the job, about making sure that things were done right. The officer's actions had shaken her, but they hadn't stopped her from doing what she had always done. She had faced difficult situations before, and she knew that this one, though significant, was just another chapter in her career. She hoped that the officer would learn from it, that he would take responsibility and grow as a person. As time passed, the officer and the woman never crossed paths again. Their lives had gone in different directions, but the impact of their encounter stayed with both of them. For the officer, it was a lesson in humility, a reminder that no one was above their emotions, and that losing control could have devastating consequences. For the woman, it was a reminder that the job wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about understanding the pressures people faced and the importance of holding oneself accountable. No matter the situation, they both moved on, but the experience changed them. And sometimes it's those difficult moments, the ones that challenge us the most, that end up teaching us the most valuable lessons of all.